The air in the apartment was thick with the cold smell of stale tobacco and ozone. Moscow, 1983. Midnight. Oleg Voronin, impeccably dressed in a Soviet functionary suit, stood rigid beside a cheap wooden bookshelf. He was listening to the silence. It was too absolute. The frantic static on the disguised shortwave radio frequency he used only in emergencies told him everything. The signal was clean, unnaturally strong. They weren't just listening. They were broadcasting their own static to mask their approach. Oleg wasn't waiting for the knock. He was waiting for the sound of leather gloves on the metallic railing of the fire escape outside his window. 3 stories above the frozen street. He reached inside the bookshelf, pulling out the complete works of Pushkin Volume 4. Inside, hollowed out with surgical precision, was not a camera or a poison vial, but a small, unremarkable microfilm canister. It contained the complete operational blueprint for Project Aurora, the USSR's proposed expansion into the Horn of Africa, complete with detailed military hardware transfer schedules. If this microfilm reached Tel Aviv, it wouldn't just embarrass the Kremlin, it would permanently shift the balance of power in the Middle East. He moved silently to the bathroom. The sound of a heavy sedan slowing below was unmistakable, the gravel crunching like broken glass. He placed the canister on the rim of the bathtub and brought down a heavy glass ashtray. The microscopic snap of the film being destroyed was barely audible over the sudden, violent jolt of a door being kicked in downstairs. That singular piece of film, now dust mixed with porcelain shards, was the culmination of 10 years of pure, distilled deception. 10 years where a minor economist, climbing the Soviet ranks, secretly bled the military-industrial complex dry. 10 years where the Mossad established a presence so deep inside the KGB's inner circle that the Soviets didn't just miss the spy. They actively promoted him. The heavy, rhythmic tread of boots started up the stairs. Until, now, tu era mi. To understand how a man walked the tightrope between ideological devotion and complete betrayal, and what happened the night the line finally broke. We must rewind the tape. We must go back to the moment the seed was planted. The quiet, almost boring beginning of the operation known only as the Glacier. The year was 1974. The October War had just ripped through the region, leaving Israel painfully aware of the massive Soviet military pipeline feeding its enemies. Intelligence was fragmented, localized, and reactionary. The Mossad needed to look beyond tactical targets. They needed to see the engine room of the Soviet machine. The decision was made at the highest level. Find a source deep within the Soviet bureaucracy, someone intelligent, ambitious, but spiritually disillusioned. Someone close enough to the levers of power to matter, but not so close as to be under constant, direct KGB scrutiny. Enter Oleg Voronin. He wasn't a spy master or a dissident intellectual. He was a promising mid-level economist in the State Planning Committee specializing in resource allocation for key strategic industries. This meant he saw the flowcharts for oil, steel, and, critically, specialized military manufacturing components. He saw the truth behind the glossy Soviet 5-year plans, the internal rot, the crippling inefficiencies, the desperate Bakshana deal. The initial contact was made, not in a dark alley, but in the glaring light of a Geneva Economic Conference in 1975. The Mossad handler, operating under the guise of an Israeli trade representative named Yossi, didn't talk about politics. He talked about numbers. He talked about data integrity and the corrosive effect of centralized lies on the Soviet economy. The recruitment process took 18 months of excruciatingly slow engagement. Yossi never asked Oleg to betray his country. He only asked him to confirm what he already suspected, that the West was miscalculating Soviet strength due to flawed data, and that this miscalculation could lead to nuclear conflict. Oleg, a man obsessed with mathematical truth, found the appeal irresistible. He wasn't becoming a traitor. He was becoming an auditor of global risk. This deliberate misdirection, the belief that he was working for the truth, not a foreign power, was the first critical layer of Oleg's defense. His training was a study in controlled boredom. Instead of explosive gadgets, he learned the art of observation, how to read the subtle shifts in the timbre of a colleague's voice, the specific sequence of locks on an archive door, and most importantly, how to appear absolutely unremarkable. His primary field of study was silence. The true breakthrough came in 1977, when Oleg was promoted to a key role analyzing resource diversion for special projects. This gave him access to the real budget lines, the ones stripped of all public-facing camouflage. His first major test involved routing information on Soviet naval movements near the Baltic Fleet. It seemed like a Loris Gate few encrypted numbers left in a pre-marked gap behind a brick in an abandoned wall. He completed the drop flawlessly. The confirmation came back weeks later, tucked into a seemingly harmless review of Soviet grain production broadcasts on a shortwave frequency. Mission successful. But the Mossad analysts were nervous. The drop location, chosen by Oleg, based on its obscurity, had been monitored by a known KGB internal security team just 48 hours before Oleg even arrived. It was too close to be a coincidence. The terrifying realization dawned on Tel Aviv. The KGB wasn't tracking Oleg. Not yet. They were tracking the environment. They had systems in place to sweep suspicious geographical areas, and Oleg had unknowingly wandered into one. Oleg, believing himself safe, continued his work. He had successfully delivered the message, but he had just narrowly evaded the silent, crushing weight of the KGB's operational perimeter. The ground beneath his feet was already shifting. Oleg's life became a masterclass in psychological duality. By day, he debated the precise allocation of titanium alloys for MiG production. By night, he meticulously photographed, memorized, and transcribed every line of sensitive documentation he could access. The deeper he burrowed, the more sophisticated his methodology became. Forget dead drops. Now, communication was solely through complex encoding techniques embedded in routine international telexis financial jargon that only Yossi could decipher. The constant tension wasn't the fear of being caught in the act. It was the fear of a momentary lapse in his cover persona. Every conversation, every casual meeting, was a potential interrogation. The Mossad needed actionable intelligence on Soviet involvement in the burgeoning proxy conflicts across Africa and the Middle East. They tasked Oleg with identifying the logistical choke points for Soviet hardware pipelines feeding the conflicts. This led him directly to Project Aurora. Project Aurora documents were stored in a secured archive vault in the ministry building. The access required 3 separate keys and a timed security clearance, administered by a cranky elderly bureaucrat named Lyudmila. Oleg spent 3 months studying her schedule, her lunch breaks, the precise moment she left her desk for her mandatory 10-15 tea break. He timed the grinding of the old fan in the hallway, a noise that masked the subtle click of the first lockpicking. One cold Tuesday, the opportunity arose. Lyudmila was delayed leaving for tea. Oleg was in the main archive, ostensibly reviewing historical economic forecasts. The room smelled of moldering paper and dust. He could feel the fine particulate matter coating the inside of his throat. The only sound was the incessant, hypnotic hum of the fluorescent lights and the tick of the wall clock, each second amplifying the crime. He knew he had exactly 6 minutes. He reached the vault door. His hands, usually steady, were slick with sweat inside his gloves. Click, click. The first 2 locks were simple, pin tumblers. The third, electronic, required him to subtly manipulate the wiring harness under Lyudmila's desk days prior, enabling him to input and override code derived from her birthday. Buzz, a heavy door swung open an inch, revealing the inner vault bathed in the pale green glow of emergency lighting. He found the Aurora file, thick, bound in heavy red tape. He quickly moved to the far corner, pulling out the miniature camera hidden in his pen. And then he paused. For a brief, agonizing moment, he stopped focusing on the mission. He thought about the men who had written these reports, men like him, driven by ideology, blind to the human cost of the strategy documented on these pages. He thought about the face of his son, Anna, whom he had seen only briefly that morning, eating kasha, oblivious to the high-stakes game his father played. The profound isolation hit him. He was performing a historical act, yet he was utterly alone, surrounded by the ghosts of Soviet history. He exhaled slowly. The clock was still ticking. He forced himself back to the task, the metallic taste of adrenaline sharp on his tongue. He began photographing the pages. The faint, high-pitched whir of the microfilm advanced, sounding impossibly loud in the echoing silence. He was halfway through the transfer when he heard it. The heavy clunk of the main archive door opening. Someone was back. It wasn't Lyudmila. The steps were too young, too quick. Oleg froze mid-frame. The file was half open on the shelf. The camera was in his hand. The footsteps belonged to Victor, a younger, highly ambitious deputy administrator, a man rumored to have strong ties to the KGB's new internal monitoring branch. Victor didn't normally visit the archives after 10 a.m. The door to the vault was still ajar. Oleg had milliseconds to react. He jammed the camera back into the pen case, slammed the Aurora file shut, and shoved it back onto the shelf. He stepped out of the vault into the main archive room. His face was perfectly neutral, the mask of a deeply annoyed bureaucrat. Victor, Oleg said, his voice calm, yet carrying a hint of cold irritation. "What in God's name are you doing down here? This room is off limits until the afternoon audit." Victor stopped, clearly startled. He was expecting the room to be empty. "Comrade Voronin." I apologize. I was looking for the historical budget report on the 1968 agricultural shortfall. I misplaced my notes." Oleg narrowed his eyes slightly, a technique he had perfected to convey managerial disapproval. "Misplaced your notes? Victor, this isn't a university library. This is the central repository of state finances. You should know better." The tension was suffocating. Oleg could feel the sweat drying beneath his suit jacket. Victor was now scanning the room, perhaps looking for the source of his discomfort. Victor's eyes landed on the vault door. It was closed, but Oleg realized with chilling dread that he hadn't managed to fully reset the third electronic lock. The tiny indicator light, which should have been green, was flickering a faint, unstable amber. Victor's gaze snapped back to Oleg. "Why is the vault light blinking, comrade?" This was the moment of failure. The mission was lost, potentially his life, all because of an unstable amber light. The prepared lines of defense were useless. Oleg didn't hesitate. He improvised a brilliant, desperate redirection. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair, suddenly breaking character from the stern superior to the deeply stressed man. "The vault light," Oleg said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur, bordering on desperation. He leaned in conspiratorially. "Honestly, Victor, I've been trying to cover it up all morning. I'm having an administrative nightmare." Victor looked intrigued. "A nightmare?" "Ludmila," Oleg whispered, shaking his head slightly. "She's been drinking again. Started early today. She tripped over the service box near the lock controls just before tea break. She swore she reset it. But... Oleg gestured vaguely toward the ceiling. "If anyone finds out, she'll be demoted, possibly arrested. Her son is serving in Afghanistan. She's desperate. I'm trying to shield her until the end of the day." He fixed Victor with a look of shared, wary responsibility. "We can't have the KGB investigating drunken sabotage, can we? It ruins the quarterly report summary. JUST. Pretend you didn't see the light, Victor, for the sake of institutional stability." Victor, sensing an opportunity to show loyalty not just to the state, but to the unwritten rules of the bureaucracy protecting one's colleagues from unnecessary internal inquiries, relaxed instantly. The amber light transformed from a sign of espionage into a sign of Ludmila's pathetic human weakness. "Of course, Comrade Voronin," Victor murmured, suddenly contrite. "I understand. I'll make sure to secure my own documents better in the future." He turned and quickly retreated, clearly embarrassed by his own earlier enthusiasm. Oleg stood in the archive for 5 minutes after Victor left, listening to the silence return. He waited until the archive door clicked shut and the faint sound of Victor's quick steps faded down the corridor. The crisis had passed. The microfilm was intact. Oleg had just saved Project Aurora, not with brute force or complex tech, but with the simple, devastating power of a relatable lie. The mission was back on track, but the close call had left a cold residue. He knew now that his decade of luck was running out. The intelligence gathered over the next few months, the bulk of which was the Aurora, confirmed the Mossad's war spheres, a massive, coordinated Soviet push into East Africa. It provided the West with time and Israel with crucial strategic foresight. But Oleg's success came at a cost. The sheer volume of intelligence flowing through the Glacier operation began to create internal ripples in Moscow. Not a direct link to Oleg, but an awareness within KGB, high command that they had a systemic breach. They began hunting for the systemic weakness, focusing not on the agents, but on the systems themselves. Oleg felt the atmosphere changing. The casual greetings became sharper. The phone lines seemed to have a persistent echo. He was no longer secure in his invisibility. The decision was made. Extraction, the plan, codenamed Odyssey, was a logistical nightmare. It required Oleg to take a pre-approved 2-week research trip to Minsk, but then covertly shift north through the wilderness to the Finnish border, where a Mossad unit disguised as Finnish timber merchants would meet him. The night he left his Moscow apartment, Oleg didn't pack clothes. He packed nothing. Anything he took would serve as evidence. He left Anatoly sleeping and kissed his wife Irina goodbye, telling her he would call from Minsk. The lie tasted like salt. He knew he would never see them again. The price of deep penetration often includes the abandonment of self. The journey to the border was a blur of diesel fumes, cheap train cars, and endless hours of cold forest roads. Paranoia became his oxygen. Every face that glanced his way in a train station, every police checkpoint, was the end of the line. He successfully navigated the rendezvous point to Swan, Israeli. One local Finnish asset met him deep in the frozen woods nearby. The handoff was silent, brutal in its efficiency. They gave him new documents, flawed, but plausible papers identifying him as an agricultural delegate traveling to Helsinki. The final obstacle was the border checkpoint itself, a cluster of cold concrete buildings guarded by young, bored Soviet border troops. They drove the Finnish timber truck, Oleg hidden under a pile of rough-cut lumber, through the Soviet side. The first check customs went smoothly. The heaviest officer barely looked up, signing the manifest with a grunt. Oleg began to breathe again. The truck pulled up to the final barrier, the line separating the Soviet Union from Finland. Freedom was 20 meters away. The barrier lowered. A young, thin guard, no older than 20, approached the truck cabin. This guard wasn't looking for spies. He was trying to fill the dead time of a late shift. He reviewed the driver's papers, then moved to Oleg's documents. Agricultural delegate. Yes, the guard asked, his breath misting in the frigid air. Oleg nodded. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times. The guard scanned the papers slowly, then tapped a finger on the photograph. The papers say, Oleg. Your papers, he said, holding them up. Say Borisiva. A cold, agonizing spike of terror shot through Oleg. The name discrepancy was a known, calculated flaw in the forged papers, a necessary evil given the time constraints of the extraction. They were supposed to ignore it. There was an administrative error in Minsk, Oleg explained smoothly, pulling the excuse directly from the Mossad playbook. I was temporarily assigned to the delegation. My proper credentials are in the main office in Helsinki. The guard looked unimpressed. He wasn't malicious. He was just doing his job, determined to find the smallest error in the rigid Soviet system. The stamp on this travel order is blurred, the guard stated, holding the paper up to the weak headlight beam. It's supposed to be a clear 5-point star. This looks like 6 points. It wasn't the KGB as a master plan. It was simply arbitrary bureaucracy, threatening to swallow him whole. The Mossad agent driving the truck, an ice-cold professional, did the only thing possible. He waited, completely silent, letting the pressure build. Any argument would confirm suspicion. The guard tapped the paper again, slowly. The seconds dragged into a geologic time. The silence of the remote border post was crushing. Oleg felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic animal trying to escape. Finally, the guard sighed. He looked not at Oleg, but at the enormous pile of lumber in the back of the truck, clearly calculating the administrative headache of detaining a shipment. Wait here, the guard mumbled. He walked into the small checkpoint shack, presumably to consult his supervisor about the 6-pointed star. Oleg waited. He didn't move. He focused on the low, steady rattle of the truck engine. He watched the steam rising from the coffee cup on the guard's desk inside the shack. 5 minutes later, the shack door opened. The guard walked out, looking irritated. He walked straight to the barrier controls. Without a word, he raised the arm. Go, he ordered, waving them through with a curt gesture, clearly deciding the blurry stamp was not worth the paperwork. The truck rolled forward, crossing the line. The air on the Finnish side smelled different, cleaner, sharper. Oleg did not look back. He merely closed his eyes, the physical sensation of survival washing over him in an overwhelming wave. The glacier had finally melted. Weeks later, Oleg Voronin, now designated asset 089, and given a new identity, sat in a secure debriefing room near Tel Aviv. The room was bright, quiet, and sterile. He was not debriefed by excited handlers offering congratulations. He was debriefed by a psychologist whose primary task was mapping the emotional and mental damage of 10 years of total deception. The initial results of the intelligence he provided were staggering. Project Aurora was neutralized before it could launch, saving Israel and its allies from a potentially devastating confrontation. The information on internal Soviet economic instability proved crucial in the subsequent decade, informing Western policy that eventually led to the end of the Cold War. Oleg, the KGB breaker, had successfully changed the course of history, but the personal cost was immeasurable. His identity was shredded. He was fluent in lies. He was haunted by the faces of his family, forever left behind in the silent prison of Moscow. His handler, Yossi, noted in his final report, "He came out functionally intact, but the man we recruited is dead. He is now a ghost of a man, driven by obligation, not warmth." Oleg was given a new life, a new home, and a pension. He was safe, yet utterly and permanently alone, a trophy hidden in plain sight. The story of the Mossad is rarely about dramatic assassinations or massive explosions. It is about the long, soul-crushing endurance of individuals like Oleg, who dedicate their lives to the most terrifying environment on Earth. The internal monologue of a double agent. Espionage, at this level, is not an adventure. It is a sustained state of psychological warfare waged against oneself, where the greatest victory is not the intelligence gained, but the simple, unglamorous act of surviving one more day. Oleg Voronin survived 10 years of it, and in doing so, he showed the world the internal fracture of the system he was forced to serve.